today's session is going to focus on informality and the everyday. And what I will show you is that informality, both in terms of people's employment and where and how they live, is in fact the normal condition in most African countries and cities. Now, the United Nations provides us with really useful metrics to understand the percentage of people who are in the informal economy outside of agricultural employment. And what is striking about this graph is that you will see informality is not unique to Africa. In fact, in South Asia, an even larger proportion of the labor force is in the informal economy. But it is very high in Africa as well. And what is useful about this graph, it helps us to understand the gender differences in terms of participation rates in the informal economy. Almost 75% of women in African economies are in non-agricultural informal employment and 61% of men. If we drill down further and we look at the African continent and we go down to the urban scale, the numbers are in the same direction, but it is more acute. So what is important about this is to remember is that even though this data stems from 2015, we know that from the early 2000s, there's been sustained GDP growth across Africa. But despite average GDP growth above 5%, it's made almost no impact on the share of informal employment in the labor market in Africa. As a result, we still see that 2/3 of employment remains informal, and at the urban level, 61% of employment is indeed informal. And the table on the right of the slide will show you examples from various African cities. And again, we remind you of the gender-based differences in terms of participation rates in the informal labor market. And as expected, it is mainly women who form the majority in most African cities. Why do we pay attention to informal employment? The reason is that it tells us that most people who are in the labor force, they are unable to afford the costs of living in the city. The costs associated with buying a house or renting, the costs associated with making sure their children are able to access educational opportunities, the costs associated with mobility, getting to work, getting back from work, and of course the costs associated with insuring your assets and your well-being. And the reason why they can't afford that is that if you are in the informal economy, your wages are substantially lower than if you have a formal job. And not just is it lower, it is also precarious. If you, for example, are a street vendor, you may make $1 on the one day, $5 on the next day, have no income on the third day. And because of that variability, it is almost impossible to plan from an economic household perspective. The last point to note here is that within the informal economy, by far the majority of people are self-employed. In other words, they're not working for a small informal business. They're in fact hustling by themselves. And again, this is important because it means that there's very little prospect that they can expand their business because they don't have the resources or the infrastructure to do so. The implication of being stuck in the informal economy, being trapped in an informal job, is that you don't have enough income, and therefore the only way of living that you can afford is to be living in an informal dwelling. Because, of course, you're not able to pay taxes, and most importantly, because you're not able to pay taxes and you're not a resident, you also can't participate in normal political life to contest the rules of the game in a given society or in a given city. Now, it is not just that people are working informally. As we can see from this graph, if we now turn to how people live, that the majority of households in sub-Saharan Africa are in fact also in informal dwellings. The good news is, if we look at the data from 2000 to 2018, there's been a decline from over 60% of people living in informal areas to about 55%. And this is telling us that there is indeed political and policy attention being paid to this particular issue. However, it is still the majority condition, which is why we talk about informality or slum living as the normal condition in most African cities. And if it's the norm, it is really important to then question whether our political systems and our policy approaches and our policy mindset, most of all, is in fact paying attention to the fact that you can't expect a modern, formal system to engage with, because that is not the reality in most of these places. The last point to make here is that Sub-Saharan Africa clearly has the highest proportion of urban dwellers who live in slums, but it is not unique to Africa. Most other world regions in the global south are struggling with the same challenges, and there are quite a few opportunities to learn from those contexts and for Africa to share its experiences with those contexts as well. Now, if we take the problem of informal employment and we combine it with the challenge of living informally or living in slums, we can begin to map out what are the systemic dynamics at play in African cities. The starting point of this is the fact that African governments at a national level and at the city government level are dramatically underinvesting in the core urban infrastructure that can support businesses and that can support informal households. And that underinvestment has a set of consequences. It means that there's very limited and very uneven access to basic services such as energy, transport, water, sanitation, waste collection, and so forth. And because of that limited and uneven access, there are very dire developmental outcomes. One, it puts enormous pressure on public health outcomes. Also, we see that in a large proportion of the city where people live in informal settlements, the educational outcomes are weak as well, in part because a lot of households can't afford for their children to stay in school beyond primary school. And because of those two factors, we see stunted social mobility. In other words, the children are not able to achieve more in life, get a better job, get better wages than what their parents were able to. Now, what this means is that at a systemic level, African countries and cities, there is an underdevelopment of human capital. And so people, the only thing they are equipped to do or that they are trained for is indeed this informal, precarious work opportunities that we've discussed already. And what that means is that household incomes remain low and precarious, which in turn also stunts social mobility. So the developmental knock-on effects or cascading effects of limited access to basic services is really important to appreciate. But it has other dynamics as well. It means that even though a household may not have access to a waterborne sanitation system or an energy grid, they still need to fulfill those functions, and so they access those services in the informal economy, in the informal market. So what we see in most African cities, when we talk about informal urbanism, is a hybrid condition where you've got formal systems interacting with informal systems in the city to make sure that households and residents have access to basic services. Those services are poor, limited, and of course they don't fulfill all the needs, but they are hybrid, and that's the important point to understand. At an aggregate level, it means that demand for these services continue to outstrip supply. And this creates a systemic dynamic of relentless competition for access to resources and control of those limited resources. And of course, that is not good for social cohesion. It means that communities, neighborhoods, different people from different ethnic and other groups, they compete for these limited resources. And often that means that the politics in the city that is meant to structure equal access is in fact skewed, and it becomes what we call clientelist politics. In other words, people know that if they are willing to bribe an official or they are willing to support a political party in the next election, that some services may come to them. And that in turn reinforces the dysfunctional overall system, which means we continue in this vicious spiral where there's an underinvestment in core urban infrastructure. So this vortex of systemic exclusion is really important to understand to make sense of what are the effects of the informal African city. Now, from a policy point of view, the biggest problem to recognize is that when you've got a predominantly informal context, it means that the tax base to in fact address the infrastructure deficits is too small to, in fact, solve the problem. So the table on the right gives you a sense of the population size of a select number of African cities. And a colleague of mine, Anton Cartwright at the African Center for Cities, has done some number crunching to show in a financial year what is the average expenditure per resident in that city on basic infrastructure and services. And as you can see, the South African cities are significantly high, around $720 per capita. But the next city in line is Addis Ababa, and it's only at $91 per capita. And in fact, most other African cities, and these are capital cities, mind you, are much lower than that. So you can see the problem here. In a context of fast urban growth, of a rapidly expanding slum populations, you simply don't have enough resources to attend to all of the needs that come with demographic expansion. And keep in mind that 55% of Africa's GDP comes from the informal economy. And that means, because value is relatively low in the informal economy compared to formal economies, that those tax bases remain small. But there are other reasons why the revenue of local authorities or national governments are limited as well. Poor households can't pay tax, they just don't have the income. But also a lot of African cities are hobbled because there's insufficient transfers from the federal or the national government to the local level. And then thirdly, unsurprisingly, we also know that there's often corruption in the system. And that means that the limited resources that's available get skewed to the wrong things. So how do we respond to this condition of informality? We've got to firstly understand the prevalence, drivers, and dynamics of the informal economy and the reproduction of informal settlements or slums. So this takes us back to the importance of data. And as we've seen elsewhere in this MOOC, it's important to work with the people who live in these slum contexts and people who are active in the informal economy to tell us what their reality is, to help us build out that empirical picture. The fourth response is that one can then move on to various participatory planning and urban development approaches so that investments can in fact begin to aggregate in these neighborhoods. And lastly, there is a lot of existing experimentation, testing of alternatives, and success stories that we can learn from. And we can adapt those and build our own good practice in other cities and organizations.